Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Hybrid Active Directory Office 365 User Provisioning, Secure and Simplify Your Hybrid Active Directory and Office 365. We've got a great presentation prepared today to talk more about overcoming the challenges of hybrid user management and how to secure your mission-critical Microsoft platforms. With us today, we have Chaosoft founder Robert Boble, who I'll be introducing momentarily. But before we get started, if everyone could take a quick moment to follow us on social media, you'll see here on our screen a QR code for each of your favorite social networks. If you take out your phone's camera, you can scan that little box below and it will take you directly to our social pages. Please like, share, and follow. We share some great info, new releases on there, so make sure you go on there and click subscribe. So let's get started. I'm McKenna. I work alongside the Microsoft experts here at Chaosoft. Just a couple housekeeping items to go over before we jump into the presentation. First off, you'll notice your microphones are muted to make sure everyone has the optimal listening experience. But we do encourage you to ask any questions you may have. So depending on how you join today, either in browser or through the app, you'll see a question or chat section in your meeting dashboard. Feel free to drop your questions in there and we'll do our best to answer them. If we run short on time today for questions, we'll make sure to reach out individually to follow up. While you're in your meeting dashboard, also be sure to check out our handout section, where we've included additional resources that you can download and share with your team. This session will also be recorded and we'll email you a link in the days following. At the end of the presentation, we'll also be sharing our contact information as well as some additional links. So if you have any questions or you're watching this on demand, please feel free to reach out to us. Also, at the end of the presentation, we'll be drawing one lucky winner of a $100 Amazon gift card. So make sure you stay on the line until then as we draw from the list of those present at that time. Whew, so now that we've got all that taken care of, let's go ahead and jump in. So today, that little giggle we have here on the phone with us is the founder of Chaosoft, Robert Boble.
Thank you, McKenna.
Bob is actually one of the leading experts in hybrid Active Directory management and recovery. And with more than 25 years in the Microsoft identity industry, you guys are in great hands today. So Bob, I'll pass it over to you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, McKenna. I appreciate it. I didn't mean to laugh on top of your presentation there. Sorry. It's a force of habit when you hear those things. So.
All good.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for taking time out. We're pretty excited to be able to talk to you about something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and working with customers to become experts in. And so let's take a quick look at what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start off and describe the challenges around user provisioning. Now, you probably know these challenges because you're sitting in this session listening and wondering, is the issue that I have going to be brought up? It might be, it might not be. You can always ask a question through the questions panel, so please keep that in mind. One of the things that is critical for people to understand is user provisioning isn't just a set of problems. It's a critical piece of IT infrastructure or a critical IT process that should be addressed. And so we're going to talk about that and how that relates to something called the user account lifecycle or user lifecycle management. User lifecycle management has several different areas associated with it. The two that we're most interested in today are describing the user provisioning process and sometimes, or maybe more importantly, the user deprovisioning process. And I'll explain why I said that deprovisioning might be more important than user provisioning here in a few moments. We'll then talk about what you need to do, not just to understand the basic implementation of a user lifecycle management process, but also how do you go about automating this? Is there a simple way to do it? Or do I need to go out and buy a huge identity management platform? The answer is you don't need an identity management platform. There are several ways you can implement an identity lifecycle management procedure policy, what have you, without having to go out and spend $1 million on a project you hope works. And then finally, we're going to talk about getting the identities in place, and then making sure those identities are resilient to adversity. User accounts are no good if you can't log in with them. Sometimes that's on purpose, and sometimes that's due to a malicious action like a ransomware attack, and we'll talk about both of those. So let's talk about the challenges of user provisioning. Now, we snuck a term in there, it's native user provisioning. And so what we're talking about is when you sit down at your Active Directory on-premise console, or if you sit down at your Azure Active Directory console in Azure, or the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 admin console. When we say native, we mean the tools that Microsoft provides for you to provision your hybrid accounts. And again, a hybrid account is simply an on-premise account that is synchronized and linked to a cloud account. That causes some issues, and we'll describe those here. But let's talk about the challenges just from a high level. Within the realm of security, manual or native user provisioning really has some fundamental things that make it insecure. First of all, it's error prone. As you're provisioning a user account, it seems like a pretty simple process. The challenge is there's no guardrails. There's nothing protecting the environment from the administrator, whether that's a malicious change somebody's making or if it is just a simple mistake. Both things happen. I misspell things all the time. And so as you go through the native tools, there's nothing to protect the environment from that. So what I'm going to use here as an example is a super simple example. The department name for an employee. As I go to enter the department name in, I can type it any way I want. There is nothing protecting it any way, shape, or form. And what that means is that I could mistakenly put in the wrong department name. Now that might not seem very important, but remember, in that particular case, there are other processes that might be driven off of that department name. For example, I might have the department name as a part of an authentication token, and so I get access to resources based on the department name, yet there's nothing protecting it. Or maybe simple, maybe group membership is driven off of the department name. That's a very common one. And some group has been granted all these members or had all these members added to it because the department name is engineering, for example. Well, if I mistype engineering or abbreviate it incorrectly or put in, sales, that user won't be in the proper group, which means my access alignment will be off. The things I'm supposed to be granting access to are not actually what I'm granting access to. And worse, I may think I typed it correctly. If I got two letters transposed, well, not the E's, but if there are other two letters and they're transposed, it could actually remove somebody, and then I have a whole expensive help desk proposition I'm going to have to go through. That's just the first item here. Deprovisioning is critical. And unfortunately, if you just disable an account or block an account, you're only really one click away from a compromise. So on-premise, a hybrid account has this ability to be disabled. That doesn't exist in the cloud. It's called blocking the credential in the cloud. And hopefully the synchronization tool is set up so if you do one, it takes care of the other. You might not get that if you do it from the cloud side. So it now is also dependent on how it's done, what the process is. Is there a series of steps that I need to deprovision it? And you don't want this in some third-party list, right? You want to really be careful in the way you're looking through these. You want to put it right in the administrative interface, whatever that might be. You don't want to have a document somebody refers to and tries to follow that playbook, we called them in the old days. Trying to translate a written set of steps into actual activity. People miss a step or they, read it incorrectly, whatever. You want something that's software based that's going to drive a set of controls to take care of these things for you. Another problem with security is that people don't perform maintenance. They don't realize, a bunch of people have left the organization for some reason. In that particular case, those accounts are sitting out there, and You may have heard stories about people who were let go and then had email continue to go to their phone for years. Those stories still persist today. And in the age of having pandemic and work at home, there is more turnover in our employment environment than it's ever been before. And so, these things become very important. A big part of securing an environment is make sure only the correct people have the right level of access and the access to the right things. So cleanup becomes a really big important thing, and whatever solution you pick, manual, provisioning and deprovisioning, scripted, or a third-party tool, you have to look for some of these things within that environment to make sure that they're ready to go for you. Compliance is another issue. A lot of organizations are under compliance requirements, whether it's SOX or HIPAA or what have you. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Manual deprovisioning is probably the most critical item to most of those. I think second to that might be verifying access or doing an attestation over access, which is associated with user provisioning, but not actually typically part of user provisioning. It's usually part of identity governance. But the manual provisioning process and manual deprovisioning process, manual assignment of access, human error creeps in all the time, and suddenly you have the wrong people with the wrong access. And for example, if you have the wrong people with access to healthcare records, you might be violating HIPAA. If you have people that are able to modify unannounced financial results and they have no business doing that, you might be violating your SOX. SOX compliance requirements, whether they're legal or regulatory compliance or just internal IT practices. Manual work breaks, and it breaks things in a way that's difficult to recover from. So just keep that in mind. And then finally, manual provisioning is expensive in terms of correcting mistakes, but just the process itself takes time. Native tools are not the fastest in the world. And when you ask somebody to do something native with the native tools, they have to go out, and the first thing they probably do is do a search to make sure that that username is available. That's what a program would do if it was automating this process. But they'll have to go do that, or worse yet, they just go ahead and try, for example, a name, creating a new user account, and they try Joe Smith, and it turns out there's 6 of them. So what do I do next? Well, and then I'm going to do something with the name to make it unique, because that's one of the requirements. So starting off, I didn't know I had to have a unique name. Now I know I have a unique name, so I tried Joe Smith 1. I have 6 of those folks, right? So now I'm going to try Joe Smith, and now all of a sudden it's completely different. So not only have I been messing around for quite some time trying to find just the first step in the process, but maybe I've now violated my compliance or internal IT requirements for having consistent naming for my user accounts. You can, speed things up or automate things with scripting or workflows. They're usually more complex than they're worth. And we're going to give you an example of that. Small scripts are usually okay. There's Power Automate, which can be used to some extent for these things. But remember, anytime you use those solutions, you become the developer, which means you have an added burden of also being the tester and ensuring that it works all the time. And so a lot of the things that are scriptable probably shouldn't be actually scripted. They probably should be programmed with safeguards and guardrails so that things don't go awry. And the last thing I'll mention is, in a hybrid environment, you have multiple environments that you're managing. It's not just one. You have the on-premise environment, you have Active Directory. You could have on-premise email too, on-premise Exchange. And in the cloud, you have Office 365 and you have Azure and all the associated things like Teams and Exchange Online and SharePoint, OneDrive. There are a lot of different pieces, a lot of different things that need to be addressed when you hire or fire somebody. And anything you do to create the account probably has to be rolled back when you have to terminate that account. So keep that in mind, that it's It's one of those things that even if you got good at doing it manually, then you have to be just as good, just as accurate to roll it back when it comes time to separate somebody from your organization. So these are just a couple of the challenges, but manual provisioning, especially with native tools, causes security, efficiency, and compliance issues. I guarantee it. Now, with that said, I'm going to put an asterisk next to it. If you have 15 people in your environment and you're very good at paying attention, you might be able to do this and not have any issues. It will happen even in small environments, but the interfaces that Microsoft provide are pretty good if you have up to maybe 250, 300 users to keep you out of trouble. And they do provide a little bit of automation. There's just a little issue down here. This is an old stat, but since 2005, there have been 815 million, it's almost a billion now, records breached from data breaches caused by incorrect access or issues around provisioning, deprovisioning, and maintaining access for accounts. So what drives this importance? We just talked about security, efficiency, and compliance being drivers for user provisioning and trying to figure out that process for your organization, and maybe, again, more importantly, deprovisioning. Well, here's why this is such an important item. Never mind that you're wasting time and it takes your IT folks trying to get new accounts created or revoking access for people who have separated from the organization. It turns out that user provisioning is the beginning of the birthplace of each of your user accounts. User accounts are how humans access your IT resources, whether that's an employee or it's a hacker. It's still the number one way people get into systems. And so, excuse me, as I look at this chart, I see, excuse me, as I look at this chart across the top, I see security, compliance, and efficiency, and I see the different areas that a provisioning process will need to touch upon under each of those. And if you look to the left, we've aligned a set of IT objectives, requirements, or priorities or frameworks that are used to help govern all this. And the idea is that user provisioning and user deprovisioning touches everything, which means it's an integral part to your zero trust plan. If you're doing threat detection to protect your identities from things like ransomware or data breaches, if you're trying to provide governance over your identities, if you're doing identity administration, or just in general trying to prevent cyber attacks from getting into your environment, all of these frameworks have this common set of components that need to be managed, and they all begin with user provisioning and deprovisioning. So this is why user provisioning and deprovisioning is so important. Again, this is part of an identity and access management project, I would guess you would call it. But I think things have been boiled down to make it a little simpler than it might have been in the past, where you'd have to go off and hire Oracle or one of those other, massive companies to come out and you spend $1 million in consulting and on software to get it done. I believe most environments or most organizations now can streamline it, especially with the efficiencies that Azure and the cloud has brought to IT. So let's talk about not user provisioning, but a little bit broader topic, which is what we call user lifecycle management. And user lifecycle management includes, at the start, user provisioning, and at the very end of it, user deprovisioning. But there's some terms here I want to use just to make things a little simpler. You're going to hear the term onboarding. You're going to hear new hires. These are terms that people use to describe the process of bringing an employee or an associate or a vendor into your environment. And we're going to concentrate not necessarily on the physical aspects of that, like assigning a desk or handing them a laptop or putting a telephone on their desk. We're going to really talk about the electronic or network access component of that. So for us, we have people that join your environment. We call these guys joiners. This is the very beginning of their association with your organization. And I don't know if they're going to be an employee or a part-time person or a volunteer, it doesn't really matter, but there's somebody who is creating an association with your organization, and you need to give them access to your network. You're going to have to create accounts in that process. You're going to enforce some standards in that process, like naming conventions. If they're an external vendor, by the way, sometimes I'll see V dash. I think Microsoft uses that, and several other major companies use that, or they'll put it at the end of the login name so that if somebody looks at that, they can tell it's a vendor account. It may just be as simple as, login names are first name with a decimal point and then a last name. Maybe you don't. Maybe it's first initial, last name. Those types of standards can be enforced. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Does the person get a mailbox? Are they entitled to have a mailbox? Another decision has to be made. So applications that they're given, what permissions they have in the environment, those are all things that have to be considered when somebody joins the environment. Now, it would be nice if you just created an account and you never touched it again, but that's not the way it works. Over time, people will be promoted, demoted, they'll join groups within your organization, like a project group or a special working group, which will require that they get additional access to resources, or that as they go, they have additional restrictions placed on their access. Updating their job title, their department, their location, city, all those things could have an impact on what they can have access to. In some cases, in the old days, people would go out and do this thing called a role mining process, where they would look to figure out, based on your role within the organization, these are the items you should have access to. People still try to do that. They typically come up with 3 or 4 roles: full-time employee, part-time employee, guest, right? Because there's so many ad hoc grants, requests, or grants of access, it becomes very difficult to manage access that way. Entitlements may be a different story, and what I mean by an entitlement might be: do you get a mailbox? Do you have access to Salesforce? Are you in the sales group? You have access to an application for sales CRM or what have you. But you have to keep in mind that those people, we call them movers, they're changers really. And based on the changes in their affiliation or association with the organization, they may have to be granted additional resources, or you may have to revoke resources. By the way, out of the box with Microsoft, it is pretty typical that people are granted resource access and never have that access revoked. That is a very typical thing we see, and a good solid user provisioning process and user lifecycle management process will take that into consideration and start to help you address those deficiencies. Next is something called pausers. This is a really awkward term, I know. It's one that we invented. These are folks that they haven't separated totally from the organization, but they're going to be in a situation where you don't want them to have access for a period of time. Oftentimes, accounts should be what I call suspended or frozen during longer term medical leave, military deployments, military service. There may be security reasons. So if I'm with a highly secure organization and I'm traveling to a foreign country, maybe during that time I'm in that foreign country, my account is going to be suspended. Or it could be a legal move. It could be, there's something that happens and there's a legal investigation that has to go on. You may suspend accounts during that investigation. Could be you got hit with ransomware and you managed to isolate it quickly enough, and you can now go out and freeze all these accounts that may be potentially the one that was compromised to introduce the ransomware. And while you're doing that process, you're going to lock those down. Maybe I should call those suspenders. No, probably pausers is best. It's probably a better term. If you can, please send that in the question section or the chat section for me. We'd love to have it. And then finally, we have what we call leavers, and this is when somebody is termed and have a final separation. And this is really more about that deprovisioning process, right? So somebody retires, they get fired, or they pass away. All 3 are very valid scenarios that happen every day. I'm sure there are others, but there's going to be a termination of the relationship between the two. You're going to lock down not just the account, but then you have to do subsequent cleanup. A lot of companies will only keep a user account for 60 or 90 days and then remove it. Keep in mind that in a hybrid environment, you have two separate environments to do all this work, whether it's onboarding somebody or it's offboarding somebody. There's a lot of work to be done across both systems. Maybe that you want to clean out group memberships where that object used to reside. You want to do, 15 other things before you finally decide whether you're going to keep that user account in a suspended state or if you're going to delete it. Lots to think about in that process. So let's dive down into user provisioning a little bit so that we can kind of discuss maybe some of the things about just this onboarding or the provisioning process for accounts. The first thing I want to mention is that there's a hidden cost here. So if you're looking at approaching your organization and trying to get them on board with either automating or completely automating or just partially automating the user provisioning process, this is probably one of the best ways to explain why this becomes an important step above and beyond the security, compliance, and efficiency concerns. There's a physical cost associated with manual user provisioning. So this kind of goes through, it's a very high level, but goes through some of the steps, and I'm going to walk you through this little graphic at the top. When somebody new approaches the organization as an employee or a contractor, you're going to have to create a user account in Active Directory for them in a hybrid environment. Once that occurs, within 30 minutes, that account gets synchronized to Office 365 so that it's available to have resource entitlements in the cloud. Now, if there is a hybrid Microsoft Exchange environment, because you used to have on-premise Exchange, or if you're going to use the new Exchange serverless deployment, you still have attributes on-premise that need to be populated for that account to work with the email in the cloud as a hybrid account. And what that means is the attributes like email address, sign-in name, those types of things have to be set properly in an on-premise Active Directory. They get synchronized to the cloud, and then there's a stub object, a stub mailbox that has to be created to redirect mail from on-premise to the cloud. And again, this also depends on other things like where your MX record is pointing and those types of things, but it's a pretty common approach when you had Exchange on-premise that you create one of these stub mailboxes. So when email is delivered to your Exchange server on-premise, it is sent to this mailbox. The mailbox knows to forward that out to Office 365 or Exchange Online. Now, in order to get a mailbox, most people will have to go through the process of assigning an Office license or a Microsoft license that has a mailbox associated with it. There is actually technically a way to do this without a license, but people just don't seem to be able to comprehend how that can be done. So typically they're going to assign the license, which means you have a 30-minute wait from the time you create the account to the time the account is already in the cloud where you can assign a license to it. And then you go back on premise and in cloud and assign group memberships or set additional attributes. And then you need to go out to configure that account if you haven't already set up policies or if the system that you're assigning the resource from doesn't have policies. So for example, in Exchange or in Outlook, what happens when you hit the reply button? Does it automatically do reply all or does it automatically just do a simple reply? Is focused inbox turned on or off by default for a particular set of users? There are a lot of other items that can be configured as well. Are they members of Microsoft Teams, specific teams, maybe based on their department name or their city location, those types of things? Are there administrative units in the cloud that they must be made members of because you're driving policy that way or management that way? All sorts of little things that have to be done. And if I do this stuff manually, it can take anywhere between an hour and 5 hours of continuous sort of either waiting or work. And if you have these different steps split over different administrative groups, it can take weeks. So maybe I'm responsible for Active Directory, but somebody else is responsible for collaboration. We see this all the time. So we create the user account on the AD side, and then we just wait and wait and wait for the Office 365 or the Microsoft 365 administrators to assign a license. Could be a separate group. Or maybe I'm the guy waiting for the account to be created, and so I have to wait 3, 4, 5 days for that help desk ticket to get put through. And so this is definitely a problem. That expands that 1 to 5 hours into weeks possibly. And I'm not kidding you, we have seen those. So if we just look at it about the time people's hands are on the keyboards doing, actually doing work or trying to get something to go, it's, anywhere between an hour and 5 hours. And if you take the average, if you go to salarysurvey.com and you take the average admin's cost, it can cost anywhere between $30 and $160 per employee or per user being added. That's again with native tools. And if you go through and you start to time yourself, you might get good at it. But in order to tweak everything to get the 25 steps, that you might need, or the 15 steps, it'll take you 3 to 5 minutes, just to sort of get started. And then by the time everything gets done and the back end syncs up with Exchange, it's probably a minimum of an hour. And you might get lucky and be able to do it faster than that. But again, that's with native tools. I think the cost savings comes in when you start to look at automating that process. An automated provisioning process might take anywhere between 1 minute, at no more than 5 minutes typically, which means you're going to be less than $1 all up in terms of cost of creating those accounts. And remember, there's also deprovisioning costs as well. Unfortunately, with automated provisioning, you either have to invest in scripting or third-party tools. So the investment isn't the time it takes somebody to do that task and their salary, to do that manual provisioning task. It's the time somebody and the salary they have writing the script or the amount of money you pay for third-party tools. But that's a pretty big cost savings going from, let's say I'm off by half and it only costs you $15 or $10 to provision a user. If you do one a year, that's not that big a deal. You'll probably suffer with it. If you have 10% turnover like many companies do and you have a larger company, then suddenly that's real money. That's a couple of salaries per year. So it might be worth the investment in scripting or finding a third-party tool to do that automatic provisioning. Now, another thing I mentioned is the accuracy, which can break your compliance, security, and efficiency, right? So automatic user provisioning or user provisioning really starts to drive identity governance. And so here are a couple things to think about in those particular cases. Identity governance is all around standards and providing guidance or governance over the process of managing user accounts and the access that they are granted or denied. The first thing about governance is you're going to have to, if you go to really understand your user provisioning process, you're going to have to understand how you guys do business. That what is the process we have? Does HR hire them? Is the employee hired in the field and we tell HR later? And are there standards that have been put in place? And I hope there are standards put in place. First one that comes to my mind in a Microsoft user account provisioning scenario is, what are the login names going to be? So when you go even at the oldest version of Microsoft's interfaces, the first thing it asks you is first name and last name, and then it asks you for a login name. That login name is the SAM account name. It's an older Microsoft format. There's also a username called a user principal name that gets generated, and that's the one that gets synchronized along with the first name, last name, display name, and some other attributes over from on-premise into the cloud. But there's typically a format to those things. So SAM account name might just be first initial of your first name plus your entire last name up to a certain number of characters. Maybe you decide that if there's a tie, meaning there's a conflict, you have two Sam Smiths, Maybe you just stick a number at the end, or maybe you introduce 2 letters of the first name and the last name, or whatever. I've seen some really interesting ways to generate a unique login name, but the login names have to be unique. That's a requirement of the system, so that the Active Directory software can tell one user apart from another user. Entitlement assignments, who gets what? Does a vendor get a mailbox and a license for Microsoft? Maybe not. Maybe they're just going to be sharing documents that they create in their environment. Maybe it's more of a business to business scenario. Are there group memberships specifically assigned to users by department, by location, by region? It could be geographical or organizational. Those are typically the 2 we see, or it could be a combination of both. So all engineers in New York City, there's a combination of geographical assignment and organizational assignment. Entitlement configuration. Are these users subject to legal hold because of the type of work they do? Legal hold is where mail is retained in your Exchange inbox, even if it's deleted. It's stored off on the side, so it can be looked at later if there's a legal question that comes up. Does this account require multi-factor or other types of things? And then finally, if you are looking at automating using HR data or your ERP data for your employees and contractors, or if you're an educational institution, you have a student information system, how are you going to map those 2? So a user in your database has to have an account that maps up in Active Directory or in Office or Azure Active Directory. What's the link between the 2? Sometimes for businesses, you'll have an employee ID you can match up. Sometimes it's done on login name. I've seen other types of ID schemes as well. Sometimes they do name matching. They know that they have a special unique name that's generated in their HR or ERP system or SIS system. That's first initial last name and then some number like the student ID. Sometimes that'll be the key, and they'll import those into Active Directory so they can map those things. What's going to be the mapping between AD and the cloud? There's a default one, maybe because you're in a more complex environment, you needed to change that. So there are all those complexities, but these are things that you have to understand in order to, these are the standards you have to understand to just get the start of user provisioning underway. In terms of identity governance, there are additional things that we're not going to talk about today. For example, entitlement reviews. We gave these folks access to these applications. Does the application owner or the data owner, are they required to review all the people that have access and prevent people who shouldn't or no longer should have access to their application or data from continuing accessing it? Is that part of this process? Well, as we start to look into that, there's something called an access lifecycle policy that most organizations will probably adopt. Could be a workflow, could be whatever. It's more of a policy, and it does fit under identity governance. And this is the process of assigning responsibility for keeping access accurate and also for helping to automate the assignment of entitlements or access to applications or data that people need to do their jobs. Whether that's a full-time employee or a contractor, it doesn't really matter. It's still a process of granting people access in an ongoing fashion. This is not just during the initial creation of the account, it's as the account goes on over time. And so typically there's a resource owner that's assigned. That's the person that understands the business justification for why somebody should or should not have access to a resource. There can be a request process in place. So end users, just a normal user might have a list of things they can ask for access to. Just today, I had an accountant ask for access to a spreadsheet in our environment, and I granted it because it was appropriate and I was the resource owner. And I knew that the business justification was that we can't file taxes without that file being reviewed by the accountant. So that was good enough justification for me. So I approved that request. That request was made by that person being sent a link. Sometimes it's a list on the screen of applications and they may choose. Sometimes that can have automatic approvals. Sometimes it's, requires a physical approval. Over time, I may want to review who has access to that information, because if inappropriate access was granted, I might have a compliance or security violation. So there's quite a bit that can go on. And then finally, as I mentioned with user accounts, access in over the past 30 years or so in a Microsoft world, it was often granted but not revoked. Again, doing resource deprovisioning or those access reviews is a perfect opportunity to make sure things are kept current. So if somebody does not need access, you remove that access. And that simplifies the process later on when you're doing things like troubleshooting security issues or breaches or leaks. So always try to use least access model anytime you're doing things, granting just the access needed to applications or data that somebody needs to do their job and no more, then have a process or a plan to review that. Let's talk about getting the most out of your Microsoft licensing. So in hybrid user provisioning, one of the big steps is getting the correct licenses assigned. Now, I chose to use a little bit older screenshot because it really shows the true complexity of Microsoft licensing, where the new format obscures it a little bit. So this was a screenshot right out of the Microsoft console, and you'll see that it is very easy to look down that list and not understand exactly what you're looking for or what you're looking at. Now, if you've been doing this for a long time, you probably recognize most of these. There are actually one on there that I had no idea what it did. I still don't really know what it does. But this came straight out of a customer environment a while back. But I really like it because it shows you all the different licenses and the applications below them. So how do you get the most out of this expensive licensing? And by the way, when Microsoft made this move to the cloud, I listened to one of their financial reporting to Wall Street, and I heard, and I'd have to go back and double check this, but I heard them talk about how cloud licensing allowed them to have better control over their licensing, but per Office user, they were working on a much better margin. I think it was up to 40% higher profit on people who are using the online version of Office versus the kind that they would get in a box and install manually or install themselves on their PC. And I'm convinced it's because of all the add-ons that they've done, and they've done a very good job at figuring out exactly what licenses people should have and then how to add on little pieces to maximize that profit. I think they've done a very good job at understanding that. It's a very brilliant job for them. For you and I, it's a cost that we want to try and minimize. So a couple things that you want to do to get the most: do automatic license assignment. You want to drive adoption as best you can. So for the licenses that you assign, hopefully you're doing it automatically, make sure people are using every bit of those licenses. And if they're not, reevaluate whether you have the right license in their assignment. Training on those tools to make people more productive. That's important. So figure out how you're going to implement training to get people using Teams correctly. Don't do attachments, do links instead, right? It's a much better process and saves not just in time, but it also saves in storage. Follow the least cost assignment model, meaning if somebody can get away with an E1, give them the E1, don't give them the E5. There's no reason for them to have all those things. If there is a reason, work up to it. You can always go up and pay a little bit more over time. It's harder, much harder, to take things away from people typically. Optimize your license costs based on the usage. So Microsoft provides usage information. You can download a list of, who's in your environment and what they're using. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't tell you that you're able to change the licenses down, but it'll show you if they have an E3 license and they're only using their mailbox, they could probably work in an E1. It won't tell you, hey, yes, you can just go make that switch. Maybe they're, above the storage limits on the E1, and you can't physically move all the mail into an E3 or from an E3 into an E1. Or maybe OneDrive is full, something like that. So there are limitations. There are third-party tools that will help you with that. So keep that in mind. Everything here is pretty well-known science. Microsoft provides some of these things, but keep in mind that you get what you pay for. And unfortunately, in this case, some of those don't have those guardrails that I mentioned earlier to make sure mistakes don't happen. All right, let's talk about user deprovisioning. What is the Great Resignation? Well, this was a real shock to us last year when we started hearing this term, and effectively it was people, in mass, in really large numbers in mass, leaving their jobs. Turnover rates skyrocketed in the United States. And there's still some of this happening today. But what was interesting is we had a piece of information we ran across from the Federal Reserve that 41% of employees were considering leaving their current employer. Whether they actually quit or not was a different story. Almost half of everybody working said, hey, anyway, the people that were surveyed, I'm really thinking about changing jobs. And with the pandemic that we saw recently, people had to make a lot of life choices that were unexpected or couldn't be foreseen, and that drove them, I believe, turned out to be quite large numbers to consider a career change. I'm going to go do something completely different. I'm in IT today. Tomorrow, I'm going to be making candles. Whatever it is, right? I don't mean to be glib about it because it is a pretty important subject, but as people left, deprovisioning became important. And the more people left, for some organizations, it became a struggle to keep up. And so this is why deprovisioning, first of all, the automation of deprovisioning can be so helpful, but also it closes the door to data breaches or for nefarious things from happening later on. Here's a couple of examples of what happens if you don't. I'll start at the bottom. Hospital workers stole patient information and is thought to have used it for fraudulent tax files because their account wasn't deprovisioned. They still had access after they departed the organization. A network engineer for an oil and gas company found he was going to be fired and so sabotaged the company's systems, returned them to their default settings. So all that time and energy to be configured to work the way they had been working was lost, and those systems were no longer valuable until they were reconfigured and brought back up. Former network administrator for San Francisco held the city hostage because they didn't give them he didn't give them passwords that they required to operate. And that person was a little arrogant, thought the people running the IT group were incompetent. That was the excuse. I know I don't work for you anymore, but I'm not giving you the passwords because you're incompetent. Wow, that's akin to blackmail, right? So these are things that we see over and over and over again. So it's very critical to realize that deprovisioning addresses a serious problem. Resignations and terminations are insider threats. They're a form of insider threat because they can cause costly outages. We already mentioned that provisioning, deprovision problems cause security compliance and efficiency failures. And the result is you either lose revenue, you're going to have a bad reputation, loss of IP, intellectual property, all those things. A couple terms that are there. Well, revenge hacks are one of those things that we hear quite a bit of. And another source of costs for these things is that if you are under legal or regulatory compliance requirements, there may be fines associated with material findings or breaches of those protocols, and those can be quite extensive and expensive. Some data over on the right, just to point out or to illustrate that this is an increasing problem, not a decreasing problem. Keep in mind that this is one of those things that is driving costs up in IT, not down. Funny enough, sometimes a small investment can result in a pretty dramatic cost reduction. So just like we had for provisioning, what's the hidden cost of deprovisioning? Deprovisioning can take anywhere from 3 to 30 minutes. It's usually pretty quick. Again, just disabling an account isn't enough. That's just one checkbox away from compromising your environment. And you may have times where you want to suspend somebody or pause the account, not completely terminate it. So there can be different processes that are involved. Again, complexity makes the chance of a mistake there pretty good. Anywhere between $8 and $16 with native tools. Automatic provisioning will take a minute or two, somewhere less than $1. And typically it's scripting or third-party tools. So let's talk about options for automating user account lifecycle management. That's cradle to grave management of the account. Automation. If you're going to automate this, the best way you can automate is to grab your HR data, if it's accurate, feed that to a script or to a third-party tool, and have it do the automated portion of provisioning and deprovisioning and the updates, the reprovisioning process automatically. Most of those systems out there are good enough now where if you can get it configured, you have good enough HR data, you'll be able to create accounts, update accounts. That should flow into changes in group membership or changes in organizational units or admin units on the cloud side. And then when somebody leaves the organization, deprovisioning the account. Some issues that you can run into, again, if HR doesn't find out somebody's working for the company for a week after or maybe until payday, that could be a problem because the data won't be there in HR to do the provisioning. HR may have incomplete data because they're not capturing it. HR data might not be accessible. We see that occasionally as well. The good news is that universally, every HR system will output a text file, and text file is sort of the least common denominator. Any good provisioning system will be able to take a text file or connect to a database. That's sort of the minimums that they do. And we have also seen situations where the HR data is encoded or is in a format that's very complex and it's very difficult to get that information into a system that could actually do the automation around provisioning or deprovisioning, whether that's a third-party tool or a script. Understanding the data can be a challenge. You need something called an anchor. That is a unique value that will allow you to tell users apart from one another within the system or across two systems. If you're using employee ID and that's being generated or tracked in your HR system and you have that imported into your Active Directory, might be a great way to join two users together. The text version might be a generated, employee nickname or username. Those are less good because they're harder to ensure that they're unique. Less good, is that the right one? Less preferable, I think, is probably the better way to say that. And then finally, identifying new changes and new employees, changed employees, or termed employees sometimes can be a little tricky. There's often a date or set of dates that you have to look at. And so you may need to have 3 different goes at that HR data, one to show just people added, one to see anybody who's only changed, and then one that shows anybody who's been terminated from the system. If you have the right data, you might get one big output or might be able to query one table to get that information, but usually it's 2 or 3 different data sources, all from the same place, but 2 or 3 different views of that data to get everything you need. But most of the provisioning systems that automate things are pretty good at helping you with that data and figuring out exactly what you need to pull it in. What about scripting? So this is an actual script from a customer. I copied and pasted into Microsoft Word. I set it to a 10-point font, so it's a pretty small font, and it still took 19 pages to display. And this was only to create user accounts. This did not change them when there were changes, and did not remove the accounts when things were deprovisioned. 19 pages, single spaced. There was an issue with this organization. Their scripter actually passed away, and they couldn't maintain the script because they didn't have anybody with the technical skills. And so they came to us and said, "Hey, Bob, can you automate this?" We did it for them. It was a pretty simple project, but the time and energy they had invested in the script was actually more. Time and cost in the script was more than the third-party solution that they chose. So, and there's probably less chance that a big problem would come up because third-party solutions are tested, and the people writing those often have years and years and years of experience. The folks writing scripts are typically grabbing them off the internet and hoping that they work. So a couple other issues around scripting, just as a cautionary tale, you can't delegate scripts without administrative permission, which means if you wanted your help desk to run this, you're gonna have to give them godlike powers to do it, or have to come up with some other mechanism, encrypted passwords or something crazy like that. They're complex to maintain, and they have to have, the person writing them or maintaining them have to have advanced knowledge. You have to understand what the schema is, what data types are, metadata types in Office at a minimum. Mentioned error prone, unanticipated changes to the system can cause problems. A couple times a year, we hear about people who script license assignments, and the order of assignment is important, and so they'll have some mistake go on. They'll go to update a license, they'll revoke a bunch of licenses and not get them reassigned, and suddenly the people are offline. Or they're scripting adding people to a group and they miss a parameter, and suddenly there's a bunch of people removed from that group, and now 1,000 people can't access their email or communications. And then finally, scripting is typically less stable than third-party apps. There's a lot going on there, but again, it's typically due to the lack of testing or independent validation that the script is architected in a way that won't cause issues. For SysOps online website, they're an Active Directory management tools review group, did a survey a while back, and 65% of the people surveyed, these were administrators, Microsoft administrators, they didn't have the time or the background to maintain very complex scripts. They could do little things, they could update a field in Active Directory, they could, query for a driver on a machine, but when it came to, scripts that took anything in terms of complexity to understand, they either didn't have the time or the knowledge to do it. That's more than half. So that limits the number of people available, drives the costs up. So by the time you get the cost complexity and the instability, it may not be a good value prop to try and build an application out of scripting languages. All right, what do you want to look for in an IAM solution? This is a user provisioning solution, something that'll do identity lifecycle. Obviously, you want something that automates manual tasks with runbooks or workflows. Something that just automates everything is probably not going to be good enough. You're going to need something that allows you to manually kick off user provisioning or add somebody to a group, as well as automate all those processes. So the native tools provide you with an interface. You can do everything manually, but no automation. You have to go off and use a different module or different piece or a part, completely separate, and running under a separate set of rules and a separate set of permissions. So look for a third-party tool that lets you or makes allowances for not only doing the automation with workflows, but then also maybe even semi-automating processes where a user is kicking that off. A help desk person or a day-to-day administrator is kicking that process off. And again, it has to have security wrapped around it to make sure they can't do things that they shouldn't be doing. If you can, use HR data, ERP data, SIS data, whatever you have based on your grouping, to automatically drive that process of hires, updates, and terms. IAM solutions typically help you sustain compliance and enforce standards. Remember, native tools don't have that. So if you're looking at a third-party tool that also doesn't have the ability to define lists for your department names or to generate automatically unique names in whatever format matches your requirement, run away from it. Also look for IAM solutions who are going to contribute to a zero trust framework. And what I mean by that is if you are having that IAM solution or that IAG solution or IGA solution, that's identity governance and administration. If you have that solution that you're looking at and it lets you delegate tasks or the execution of automations at a least privilege level, definitely go for that. Microsoft has roles built into the cloud. They have nothing like that on premise. They have groups. And often you need a lot more permissions to do things than you really should. It's sort of an all or nothing security model in many cases. People would argue with me saying that, but it's true based on the popularity of third-party tools that resolve that security problem. So, but these are just some of the things you want to look for. Also, you want to make sure that not only are you provisioning these things on an ongoing basis between the provisioning and deprovisioning, that middle section of the life of that account, you have to make sure it continues to work. So that means updating it, of course, but also protecting it and making sure that it's resilient from problems that would prevent a user from getting access to it. And that can be as simple as somebody accidentally removes a bunch of people from a group and you need to figure that out quickly and put them back. It could be all the way to a ransomware attack where your on-premise directory has been compromised and no longer works. So this is what we mean by identity resilience. So we had a study commissioned by a group that is now owned by Gartner. What were the 3 factors that an identity directory failure, this is Active Directory on premise, what do you worry most about in your environment? We gave them 5 items to choose from. This is the ranking. Number 1, their entire organization would cease to operate. So you can imagine Best Buy, if it ever got hit and their user accounts got locked up from a ransomware attack and they were completely offline as a company, how much that would cost them. It's their daily sales, right? Nobody can log into their cash registers, et cetera. Now people think, oh, well, that would never happen. Nobody would ever use cash registers hooked to Active Directory. Well, guess what? Target several years ago at Christmas time, their cash registers were compromised because a HVAC, and heating and air conditioning company was a vendor, had a Active Directory account that wasn't locked down or deprovisioned properly. And they compromised that account, worked their way back up into Active Directory, and eventually took over the cash registers. So every time people would buy something at Target during the holidays, the credit card would get hit and money taken off to some strange foreign country. But this is kind of frightening because they're saying, these are IT managers saying, hey, our business would stop if Active Directory failed, right? Or at a minimum, that person couldn't do their job because of that. Less down the path, a little less concern was the amount of money they would lose, or they would lose data, they'd get a bad reputation. So it really points out today how important it is to make sure your Active Directory, your hybrid Active Directory user accounts continue to work. So let's talk about recovery versus identity. So, recovery versus identity resilience. Recovery is a process that you perform in an emergency. So, for example, we got hit with ransomware, and now I'm going to try to do a recovery of Active Directory. That is a recovery. Resilience is not a process or a set of steps. Resilience is a strategy to withstand different things that could potentially impact the use of a user account. So it's not just about ransomware, it's also around mistakes or malicious changes made to the data within Active Directory. It's also about putting in controls that make sure that I don't make an adjustment to something that would impact that data, not directly, but indirectly. For example, changing a department name incorrectly. A department name might be used to grant access to a resource, and by removing or changing the department name, I've inadvertently revoked access to that resource for one or more employees or accounts. If ransomware does hit, how do I make sure that I can instantly recover from that so I don't have an outage? So the idea behind resilience is tighter control over your directories, your identity, and your data for those things. It also includes monitoring for changes so that when something does appear to happen, that you can see what was changed so you can roll that back. And then also provide a strategy for a total and complete failure of the directory and how to get that back as quickly as possible. And that may include threat detection, right? So not just change monitoring or alerting on suspect changes, but also let's go look for things that might be misconfigured or could be exploited, or maybe is being actively exploited to prevent an outage for my users. A couple of best practices on identity resilience: don't rely on native methods. The recycle bin is not going to help you with a majority of the problems you will encounter. And here's why. Recycle bin is undelete only. It's not undo, it's not roll back, it's undelete. That's it. So if I make a bunch of changes to an account that revoke access or disable it in some way, or change the data, recycle bin isn't involved at all. If I delete an account, that's when the recycle bin becomes active. And in the cloud, it happens. Anything deleted gets put into the recycle bin for 30 days, then purged. On premise, there is a recycle bin, but it has to be enabled. And once it's enabled, then you have a time period where you can recover it easily. And then after that, it's a little bit more difficult. You actually have to have a tool to recover it, an Active Directory recovery tool to do that. But to restore that object can happen up to a year. So you do have a little bit of time, but don't rely on the recycle bin because it's certainly not enough. If somebody ran a script or goes and selects a bunch of accounts and makes a bulk change, that is not going to, recycle bin is not going to be impacted or have an effect on that. Next thing, take the mentality you're going to prepare for when an attack happens or when an outage happens, not if it happens. That's the worst thing that we've seen. People think, well, I'll get to a recovery posture or resilience implementation next year because if something happens, then we'll really wish we had done it, but it probably won't happen between now and then. We see that constantly. Lincoln College, unfortunately, was hit with a ransomware attack, took out their Active Directory. They had no way of returning that directory to use, put the college out of business after 150 years, something like that. Just recently happened at the end of 2022. Plan for when the next cyber attack is going to happen, how you're going to defend against it, identify the threats it poses or threats that might be exploited, verify your administrative controls, use that least privilege principle. That's important. Zero trust does cover a portion of that. Try to get to zero trust or implement a zero trust strategy. Use isolated labs and recovery or resilience. You want to be able to do a backup and recover your entire forest or directory periodically to test the recovery. If you could test it continuously, that would be ideal. Unfortunately, with most Active Directory recovery tools, you don't know if it'll work until you actually have to do a recovery. And unfortunately, with updates to system drivers or to virtual machines or to the hardware or to the operating system, the chances of failure happening can be introduced easily. So you want to look for something that avoids some of those issues. And definitely use a more modern third-party forest recovery solution. On-premise Active Directory must be protected. And the faster the recovery, the better, instant if possible. There are solutions out there that now do that. So here's kind of an interesting little question. What do these server backup vendors all have in common? There's Veeam, there's Managed Engine, there's Acronis, Commvault, Druva, and by the way, you can pick any others that are doing server backups, and they all say the same thing. They all say they will recover Active Directory, but they don't. So whatever your server backup vendor is, you will see something on their website, I guarantee, about recovering Active Directory. And I will tell you that is not correct. They will recover the servers Active Directory resides on. The most common reason that Active Directory is taken out and you have a directory or an identity outage is from ransomware. Unfortunately, that infects the operating system, which means the backups contain that problem because they do a full brick level recovery. So you want to look for a recovery solution of Active Directory recovery in particular that just brings back the AD data in a way that it won't cause a reinfection. We call those clean backups. And you want to be able to recover those in a way that you're sure that recovery is going to work. Even if you don't have the ability to test it continuously, you want to make sure it works. So it's important. Whew, thank you so much for taking time out. I wanted to mention there's a companion live demo of our tools, the Chaosoft tools, to show you how to automate and to do automatic user provisioning to hybrid Active Directory or Office 365 using HR data, or just simply automating the processes behind some of those more complex steps. We'll also show you how we implement identity administration, identity governance, and identity resilience in that demonstration. If you want information on additional events, you can go to chaosoft.com/events, and you'll see other webinars that we have. So now a word from our sponsor, Chaosoft. We provide solutions in 3 areas: for management, monitoring, and recovery for hybrid and cloud Microsoft environments. Under the management, we have a product called Administrator. It is a 3-tier architectured solution that provides least privilege administration, automation, and allows you to add controls over day-to-day administrators and end users to allow them to help you manage the environment without damaging your environment. We also provide a complete change monitoring solution that works in hybrid mode, so you can see what's going on premise with objects and in the cloud for your identity objects. It does not rely on event logs, which are oftentimes the first target of an attacker when they come into your environment. And then finally, we have recovery of Active Directory, both on-premise and Azure Active Directory. We do 2 types. First of all, we do hybrid recovery, which means an object that is a hybrid object can be recovered automatically from both on-premise, and then we automatically do all the things to do the recovery in the cloud as well. But more importantly than that, we do object change rollback, meaning if you see 1,000 people removed from a group, you can find that group and undo that change, and it'll roll it all back. Or if other types of changes happen that you consider unwanted, either malicious changes or mistakes, very quickly identify those through a change auditing interface that is one of the best out there, and then instantly roll it back. We also have instant forest-wide recovery, and we do that using a standby directory created in either Azure or in Amazon's cloud. The idea there is that every night we take a snapshot of the Active Directory data and its configuration, and we basically clone your Active Directory forest in the cloud, either in Amazon or in AWS or Azure, so that you have an exact duplicate of your Active Directory running at all times. And if somebody does get in and they interject ransomware into your environment, you don't have to pray that it's going to recover. You know it's already recovered because it was recovered, a night ago, 12 hours ago or whatever. And you can do that every night if you need to, or every other night. And it's a little bit less costly because of the way licensing works in the cloud. So you don't have to worry about parking hardware or VM licenses out there and not having those accessible and paying for them. You only pay really until when you need to do a recovery. The testing and nightly construction of the backup Active Directory typically isn't something you get charged for in those other environments. With that, I'm going to turn that over to McKenna to walk us out. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We really appreciate it and hope to see you on the demo.
Thanks, Bob. All right, everyone. That concludes our presentation today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and hope you enjoyed the webinar. At this time, we'll go ahead and take attendance for the gift card drawing, and we will email the winner directly for more information. You'll also see on our screen here a few quick links for the Chaosoft website. Should you have any additional questions, you can visit chaosoft.com/question. If you'd like to schedule a personalized demo or get a free trial, you'll see those links here as well. We also have a QR code on the screen that you can scan with your phone's camera. It'll take you directly to our demo request page. Again, as Bob mentioned, we do have a live demo coming up, so you can find that on our events page. And of course, for more information about Chaosoft and our solutions, feel free to visit chaosoft.com. Again, thank you so much, and everyone have a great day.